It's my honour, pleasure to open this, the third session of our workshop, An Army That Has a State. And we look forward to as exciting a day as we had yesterday. And this session is entitled The Security Sector's Impact on Identities and the Public Discourse. This section will end at 12:30. Make sure the clarity is absolutely right. We have four speakers or presenters, all distinguished. The first is Professor Schiff, who is director of the Alumni Leadership Giving Program at Harvard University, the School of Public Health. That's all she's written in her bio, which is far too modest. I mean, she's known to us really, in addition, the author of a most important pioneering article, which introduced concordance theory and its application to the Israeli civil-military situation. And from what I understand, I've read the paper, what we're going to hear this morning, in fact, is another look, or a return to that subject. And the title of Rebecca's talk is Civil-Military Relations in Israel, Revisiting Israel as the Uncivil State. Each of our speakers will speak for 20-25 minutes, and then we'll take questions for each paper. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you, Stuart, and I want to thank Gabi Sheffer and Oren Barak and Amiran Oren again for inviting me to this conference. It's always a privilege and a pleasure to come to Israel and to share my work with all of you. I also want to thank Shulamit Laron for just doing an impeccable job of connecting and organizing all the international participants. She really got us all together, and she got us all here and across many miles. And finally, I want to thank Moshe Lissak, who's being honored at the conference this afternoon, as he should be. He was a member of my dissertation committee at the University of Chicago, and he's been a great inspiration to the work that you're going to see here and to my work in general that I did at Chicago. That committee was a very political science-y committee and really needed was in critical need of a sociologist who had both a theoretical and a historical perspective of Israeli society. So I thank you again, Moshe, for your support. The title of my work is Concordance Theory of Civil-Military Relations, the Israeli Case Study Revisited. And what this work is, let's see, I just learned how to do this. What the topic of this presentation is really all about is the topic of domestic military intervention. And that topic really involves things like coup and supplantment and palace revolts, the things that militaries do inside of a state that are usually pretty negative. And the crux of the work is really how to predict the occurrence or prevention of domestic military intervention. And specifically, I have pointed to several case studies, but in this particular, for this particular conference, obviously the Israeli case. I first conducted my research in Israel during the late 1980s and the early 1990s. I sat here for several years. I immersed myself in the culture and the language and the people, and I worked very closely with people at Hebrew University, with professors at Bar Ilan and other places, and really tried to grasp the citizens' military culture here in Israel. And what I'm doing here is revisiting the Israeli case. Where is Israel now within the context of civil-military relations several years later? I also have to mention that I grew up in Southern California in a city that had the second largest Navy base in the country. And that particular city had a very, very distinctive civil and military spheres. We never saw the military when I was growing up. They were off on an island all to themselves. We would see aircraft carriers from a distance, and there was clearly a distinction between military institutions and civilians. And so given that perspective, that, that childhood really of mine in that particular city where there was that civil-military distinction, and then coming here to Israel, I basically am revisiting the Israeli case with both of those experiences. Now, the current theory of civil-military relations really does focus on civil and military separations. And Samuel Huntington came up with this theory of objective civilian control many, many years ago in the post-World War II period during the Cold War. And it's been the long-standing theory of the field. And it basically argues this, that there should be a separation, a complete distinction between civil and military institutions, and that the military should really be subsumed or subordinate to civil institutions. And that's basically the crux of the thesis of the theory. Now, there have been variations of the separation theory, and they include Peter Feaver's agency theory, Doug Bland's civilian direction of the military. But all of these theories, even though they're more recent theories, really still focus on the separation of civil from military institutions. Now, what the theory really does is it neglects cultural understanding and analysis in favor of institutional interests. So it treats culture, for example, as what one scholar calls an intervening variable. And that's my colleague Michael Desch, who's wrote the book Civilian Control of the Military. And the title speaks for itself. Again, it's really focusing in on civil institutions separate from the military. Peter Feaver argues in his book, The Armed Servants, that the civil-military distinction is the sine qua non of all civil-military relations theory. He basically said, this is it, folks, and if you don't abide by this theory, you're really not in, the realm of the true civil-military theory. Now, much of the current theory also assumes a democratic form of government. And I believe that the topic of domestic military intervention should not assert any specific form of government, but should focus on the issue of intervention itself. We're already superimposing American and Western European civil and military distinctions on everybody else in the world. And so to superimpose another form or another term, another type of government on nations, I think is really ill-advised. And so the topic of domestic intervention should really not focus on any type. And I'll give you the Israeli case as a great example. Here you have a democracy, but your democracy looks very different from the British democratic system and certainly from the American democratic system. Now, I offer up the concordance theory and some clip art. The concordance theory really offers an institutional and a cultural analysis of civil-military relations. It combines institutions and culture and doesn't just settle for the civil-military distinction. And the argument behind concordance is that if there's agreement among the three partners over the four concordance indicators, then domestic military intervention is less likely to occur. And the three partners are the military, the political elites, and the citizenry. So here you have a theory that doesn't just focus on institutions, but you're focusing on the military, you're focusing on the people who decide things about the military within the political establishment, and you're including the rest of the country too. What does the rest of the country think about the position and the status of the military in their own society? Now, part of the argument, of course, is that there should be agreement among these three partners, but over these four indicators. And the first indicator is the social composition of the officer corps. The second is the recruitment method. The third, political decision-making process. And the fourth is military style. The officer corps composition basically involves the ethnic, the socioeconomic, the religious, all the different kinds of variables and backgrounds that go into what makes up the officer corps, and there needs to be agreement among the three partners over the composition of the corps. The recruitment method basically refers to the recruitment of the rank and file. And what I do is I borrow from Sam Finer's book, Man on Horseback, and basically point to either coercive intervention or coercive recruitment or persuasive recruitment. And quite honestly, if a nation has a more persuasive form of military recruitment, there's more likelihood that concordance will take place over the recruitment method of the military. The third is political decision-making process. And these are the governmental aspects of a nation, the arms of the nation, the people of the nation, who basically decide on things like military budget, what kind of arms the military needs, the type of training the military might need, all the different aspects of what needs to go into a viable and healthy military for that particular nation. And then finally, it's military style. That's the fourth indicator of concordance. And this is really the cultural and anthropological and sociological indicator. This really talks about things like military uniforms, the symbology of the military, the rituals of the military. It's very much what Janowitz referred to as what makes a professional soldier, but he wrote specifically about what makes a professional American soldier. And so military style is going to look very different in Israel, as it'll look different in Argentina, as it'll look different in the United States, and it'll look different certainly in a country like India. So, but again, the argument is there should be agreement among these three partners, the political elites, the military, and the citizenry, over these four indicators of concordance in order to prevent domestic intervention. Now, concordance can predict domestic intervention, and it can also show the evolution or transition from a condition of concordance to a condition of discordance. So, for example, one of my other case studies examines the Perón period in Argentina. And for a short while, you actually had a condition of concordance where you had agreement among the three partners over these four indicators in Perón's Argentina, but you saw over time the evolution or the demise of those agreements that eventually evolved into a condition of discordance. Pakistan, as opposed to India, for example, also has a case of discordance. Now, concordance really challenges the current civil-military dichotomy of the field. And nations like Israel, lacking strong civil institutions and civil societies, require a theoretical framework that's sensitive to indigenous culture and institutions. Concordance, I believe, provides that theoretical framework. And concordance theory does not assume or preclude any particular type of government. So now we turn to the Israeli case study. Now, Israel has never experienced any form of domestic military intervention. And the overlapping of civilian and military boundaries that we find in Israel really does challenge the current civil-military relations theory. That theory, again, being the separation of civil institutions and military institutions. Moreover, what you have in Israel is a condition of high external threats. And according to another theorist by the name of Harold Laswell, he claims that if you have a nation under severe external threats, the likelihood of domestic intervention, or even worse, like a totalitarian state, is more likely to occur. I argue, and of course this has not happened in Israel, and I argue that Israel is in fact an uncivil state, and I wrote this in a security studies piece in 1992. And that's because a very distinctive civil or civilian sphere is very difficult to find in the state of Israel. And yet, there's no incident of coup or any type of form of domestic intervention. So it's a real quandary and a real problematic if you look at it from a theoretical perspective in the field. So, what is it that makes Israel uncivil? Well, civil, first of all, implies distinct from military. And there were several speakers yesterday who talked about the overlapping boundaries, the permeability. In my paper, And I'm just going to read you a quick, a few sentences from it that sort of encapsulates a lot of what we learned yesterday and a lot of what we know about Israeli civil-military relations. Similar to the officer corps and the decision-making process, the Israeli conscription method and military style supports Israel's uncivil quality. Culturally and socially, Israel's security condition dramatically influences the average Israeli citizen. Belonging to a community of citizens in Western terms often means being a civilian, which can be defined as one who does not professionally belong to the military. Although most Israeli citizens do not consider the military a permanent profession, the military is highly intrusive. Security issues penetrate the average Israeli's life to such an extent that the term civilian has a problematic connotation in this nation of citizen soldiers. So that's the first sort of quality of Israel's uncivil status. The second is that the whole concept of civil is really a historical one, and it emanated in Western European history after the Enlightenment period. And if we look at that history, and if we look at the status, historically at the status of Jews in Western Europe, we find that, in fact, not only does Jewish history not benefit from the concept of civil in Western Europe, but that Israel becomes a historical result of it. So in my paper, and I'm just going to read you, again, a couple of sentences, I argue that civil and civility are largely considered positive attributes. They often signify politeness, courtesy, good manners, and graciousness. If we look at the history of civility, however, Jews in Europe did not benefit from the polite and rather subtle forms of social exclusion combined with the historical lack of legal protections. Their Jew-at-home, man-on-the-street mentality during the 18th and 19th centuries fostered their participation in rituals of social civility, but prevented them from demanding and acquiring much-needed legal and political rights and protections from their host nations. This social participation played a role in the demise of large segments of European Jewish populations and cultures in the 20th century. So simply from a raw cultural perspective alone, politeness and manners in a civility society appears inappropriate to the Israeli case from a historical, cultural, and political context. Now, if you look at the definition of civil, I mean, if you just go to the dictionary and look at the definition of civil, one of its definitions is secular, not religious. And so the argument that's been made by people like Stuart Cohen and other scholars in the field that talk about the religious influence of the military, and quite honestly, the religious and biblical influence of the entire state of Israel, really goes against the grain of having a distinct civil society, because as nations in Europe were beginning to separate their civil institutions from their military institutions, so too were they separating church from state in nations like, Great Britain and France and then later in the United States. So I also write about this other aspect, the non-secular aspect of Israeli society. Israel is not a theocracy, but its historical roots are grounded in Jewish history and biblical themes, and there has never been an attempt to truly separate religion from politics. Institutionally, Eisenstadt writes that the Yeshuv pre-state period leaders proceeded investing the rabbinical courts all jurisdiction in respect of civil and personal status, a move which has inspired controversy to this day. Israel's affirmation of religious influence is another example where the blurring of civil and religious boundaries precludes the characterization of a distinctive civil society. So in all of these areas, in all of these aspects of civil, Israel really falls short. But it falls short in a positive way, because what happens in Israel is that non-civil character has really resulted in this complete overlap of religion and civil and military boundaries, and it has really helped prevent domestic military intervention from taking place in this nation. The question, therefore, is why do Israeli scholars often adopt the civil-military dichotomy? And I found this to be sort of a surprise when I arrived here and read all the literature. Everyone agreed that there was this, integration of civil and military, that there was a militarized society, the military was everywhere, and yet they still characterized the Israeli case study in terms of the civil-military dichotomy, and started talking about civil society in Israel. Well, first of all, the civil-military distinction is the prevailing theory. And most scholars, quite honestly, want to be included in the current literature, in the current theory. They want to be part of the club. Israel also is considered a Western nation with close associations to Britain and to the United States. So it's not that Israel is a primitive country or Israel is an underdeveloped country. It's actually considered quite Westernized. And so that's another reason why many scholars tend to include it in the current theory. There is one group, and if I can find that quote, of Israeli scholars that really do understand the quandary of it, and I don't think I have it, but there's an article that I did find where there's a group of Israeli scholars who really do understand that this is a dilemma, that in fact Israel does appear to not have a distinct set of civil institutions, but indeed they still want to be part of the Western, civil-military distinction, because that is the theory of the field. Okay. However, when we look at uncivil Israel, it really does explain the lack of domestic military intervention. The overlapping civil and military boundaries have resulted in a concordance or an agreement between the military, the political elites, and the citizens. So this in no way is a presentation meant to, cast a negative shadow on Israel. Its uncivil quality has actually created a great thing, and something that a lot of developing nations have not experienced, and that's the lack of domestic intervention or coup d'etat or things, a lot of bad things that nations in places like Latin America have experienced. We have agreement over the four indicators: the officer corps composition, the political decision-making process, recruitment method, and military style. We have high external threat conditions that can result in military intervention or a militaristic state. But in fact, Israel's lack of civil society has created a partnership, or as we heard about yesterday, a security network that indeed averts the traditional military takeover. So the result is a highly militarized society, not a militaristic state, but a militarized society that embraces the military's role in national security and policy. Now, if we look at uncivil, 2 more minutes. If we look at uncivil Israel today, we're looking at the security network that Barak and Schiff talked about, which I completely agree with. I'm not certain I agree with its theoretical underpinnings, but I do agree that on an empirical level, what Barak and Schiff have done is really pointed to this continuous and overlap and network between the military and the civilian, the citizen society. So as I stated in the paper, as the Israeli political, social, and military landscape continues to evolve, the prominence of what Barak and Schiff call the security network remains strong and ultimately embraces the uncivil nature of Israel. And then Yoram Perry, whose work I've read a lot of before when I was here and after, I think also points to the interchangeability of boundaries. In this particular paper, he writes, I've taken issue with him because he points to 2 coalition of military officers and civilian officials. And I argue that they really don't exist, that the military, again, is so integrated into so many facets of Israeli society that to really focus on just 2 coalitions, the military and the civilian institutions, really doesn't do justice to the Israeli case. And then finally, I talk again about military culture, the uniforms, the institutions, and how the military has penetrated politics and the military-industrial society. And quite honestly, you know, the focus on symbology of the uniforms, the casualness of the Israeli uniforms really does reflect, again, the interchangeability of citizen to soldier. I was in a restaurant a couple of days ago. 2 women came out of the restaurant in regular clothes, and at first I thought they had, you know, just, you know, bags over their shoulders, and I took a double take and realized that they were both carrying M16s as if, you know, they were just having, you know, a natural day. And I thought to myself, this would never happen in the United States. But in Israel, it's, you know, it's the way of life. No one thinks twice about it. It's the culture. It's very informal, and it's very natural. Finally, the last argument that really focuses on the incivil quality, or really emphasizes the incivil quality or uncivil Israel, is, I think, Stuart Cohen's piece on Kippah Sedugat. And what he really does is focus on really the increase, or the most conspicuous growth, as he calls it, in the number of male troop formations who adhere to Orthodox Jewish practice and now wear Kippah Sedugat. On the top officer side, he says, well over a dozen brigadier generals in the field formations now wear Kippah Sedugat, as do 4 members of the general staff. Cohen further emphasizes the extraordinary commitment to combat military service that was once reserved mainly for those who grew up in a secular kibbutz society. This is the final nail on the whole secular, you know, or uncivil argument. Because when you look at the amount of religious influence that penetrates the society, that penetrates the military, that you don't find in nations with distinct civil sectors, this really does, again, emphasize the uncivil nature of Israel today. I just want to close. There's possible future trends for Israeli civil-military relations. The external threat conditions may continue to diminish, and that could change things, although Iran, I think, still poses a threat, and you have the Palestinian Jewish settler revolt. You may have in the future a smaller, more nimble armed forces, a greater reliance on technology, which is probably already the case, and perhaps in the future less political and cultural attachment, again, as the threat conditions to Israel perhaps will diminish. And then you might have a revision of religious identity without compromising the Jewish state. But I just want to close with the following quote that sort of summarizes concordance theory as it applies to Israel revisited. The uncivil character of Israel reflects the unique influence of the military and non-civil aspects of society, such as religion, on a modern state that has been successful at staving off domestic military intervention. Israel is a young, developing nation that has not suffered the fate of Latin American and African nations, where the military looms as a threat to society and is often not considered a viable and helpful partner. Concordance exists in Israel because the military, the citizens, and the political establishment negotiate the army's presence and influence among the officer corps, the political decision-making process, the recruitment method, and military style. Concordance theory captures the uncivil character of Israel without having to superimpose predetermined spheres or categories that are based on in Western and 20th century American culture, and they may not have the same meaning in other nations. Concordance is a useful theoretical tool for predicting the occurrence and prevention of domestic military intervention in Israel and other nations around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes. Short comments, questions. Rami, short. Ron, yeah.
Rebecca, this is obviously, I actually very much liked your old security studies article, and I actually don't want to take issue, and perhaps others will, with what you have to say about Israel as an uncivil state. I generally find that quite insightful. Instead, I want to sort of ask you a couple of questions about concordance theory, which, as Stuart suggested in his opening comment, has been quite influential and is well cited and all that. And these questions are really questions in some ways of clarifications, though they may come out more challenging than that, because there's been an abiding puzzlement to me about sort of three, and I'll try to do this really briefly, three quick questions. One, first question, in some way, it's not the question, if everyone agrees on your 4 indicators, it's not the question of who guards the guardians, the fundamental classic question of civil-military relations. Isn't it really sort of trivial? In other words, the fundamental insight of the traditional problematique, regardless of whether you buy the Huntingtonian distinctions or not, is to show when there is no agreement, when there is difference, control of the military is inherently problematic. How the guardians have a lot of disposal, have a lot of power at their disposal. How do you go about controlling the military? And certainly there's, regardless of whether the spheres break down, there's a distinction between people who wear uniforms and people who don't at the end of the day. People who actually have control physically over the guns and people who don't. In the lack of intervention, which is your fundamental prediction, isn't it utterly unsurprising? So I suppose sort of the question at the end of the day is this really sort of a particularly surprising outcome? It doesn't sort of render a sort of border on the trivial. The second and related question is, why these 4 indicators? What's distinctive about these 4 indicators, and what's the causal relationship between these particular composition of the officer, recruitment method, decision-making process, and military style? How do those cause or lead to non-intervention? It was not very clear to me why these 4 things, are they all 4 jointly necessary and sufficient? If you had 3 of them, would it do the job? It's not clear to me why that should be the case. That's sort of related to the first. And the final question is, how is agreement forged? You make the claim that this is both, like traditional civil military relations theory, it's supposed to be both descriptive and prescriptive. And if that's the case, so what matters, and by what processes is agreement forged? Is it deliberation, coercion? Does it matter at the end of the day? On the one hand, you suggest very, very briefly 2 methods. One is legislation or decree or constitution, right? That's one method. Now, of course, that just simply begs the question of why does the military possibly feel bound by legislation, decree, and constitution at the end of the day, or may not, and there seems to me we need to problematize that. We need to ask a question about it. The other one has, and that, of course, yields, if you were right about that, and I have my doubts, at least as an explanatory measure, that yields some prescription, certainly, as to what kind of legislation you might want to pass. And then you suggest, talk about also long-standing historical and cultural values. Now, that may very well be true, but of course that tells us nothing about prescription, because we can't prescribe that you should have long-standing historical and cultural values that are going to actually be conducive to these kinds of things. It's a little difficult to do that. But isn't that, it also yields another question. Isn't what's really important here something, it seems to me, that concordance theory doesn't seem to tell us an awful lot about, which is what actually explains these processes of when you get agreement and when you don't get agreement. In other words, you may be right that agreement is important, and in fact, and even if agreement is, or in those cases, it's trivial, what's really not trivial is when you get agreement and when you don't get agreement. And about that, I may be wrong, but it's not clear to me that concordance theory tells us an awful lot. So these are more questions about the larger theory and the comparative project in which you wish to place Israel than it is about the Israeli case.
I think that we're going to have another session.
Let me just be very, because we really have 5 questions here, right? Let me just be very brief, and you and I can have a dialogue later, Ron. First of all, this is not about who guards the guardians. That's Huntington's question. My question is, what prevents or creates domestic military intervention? I don't want to deal with Huntington's question. I think Huntington's boring, and I think he's inappropriate to most nations around the world. When there is agreement, when there is disagreement, how do you control the military? I only show, basically, what Concordance does is it explains case studies. I can show, for example, why it is that India looks very different from Pakistan. Now, India, you would think, which has traditionally had strong civil institutions until about the 1980s, you would think, you apply Huntington, civil, military, and you're done, because the military abides by the civil institutions. But it doesn't explain the context of India. The makeup of the officer corps. You're focusing on, for example, my indicators. The makeup of the officer corps is so crucial to the health of a nation and its position of the military. Is it representative of the society? or has the nation decided that it should not be representative of the society? And those are the crucial questions that Concordance really addresses. Now, for example, in terms of India and Pakistan, the reason you have the state of Bangladesh today is because Pakistan pretty much ostracized all of its East Bengali sector to such an extent that they just ended up creating their own nation. And Concordance can explain that. It can go into the culture and talk about the different variants and the different socioeconomic and religious and cultural backgrounds that go into the officer corps, where Huntington's theory cannot, because he just doesn't care about culture. Now, in terms of the indicators themselves, I do believe that the officer corps composition, the political decision-making process are probably the two really critical indicators. Recruitment method is also very important, and military style really focuses in on sort of emphasizing more the culture of the society. It's not unimportant, but I think that the two most important indicators of concordance are really the officer corps and the political decision-making process. I selected those indicators after doing a tremendous amount of research in civil-military relations and really found those elements to be critical in all of the long-standing literature on militaries, and really isolated those as really critical pieces of what goes into the composition and role of militaries. The issues of values and the issues of processes you and I can talk about later. I think there was another question around.
I'm afraid we're going to have to move on because otherwise we're not going to give each panelist his due. Thank you very much indeed. Yuval Benziman. Yuval Benziman is just completed, I think, his doctorate at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he brings a new focus to our discussions. His dissertation was on the Israel-Arab conflict and Hebrew prose fiction of the 1980s, and his background is in both psychology, conflict research, and in literature. And the subject of his talk today is the contradictory representation of the army in cultural texts of the 1980s.
Let me thank Gabi, Orna, and Ami as well, and excuse me for reading from the paper. I don't feel my English is fluent enough to speak without it. The Israeli poet Chaim Guri once told a story about a conversation he had held with an Egyptian intellectual, Dr. Hussein Fawzi, who told him that every intelligence officer must study poetry. Had the Israeli intelligence read the Egyptian poetry written after 1967, Fawzi told Guri, Israel would not have been surprised by the breaking of the 1973 war. This observation is probably exaggerated. Poetry, literature, or any other kind of cultural text does not contain military data. Yet, such texts can tell us about the society in which they are written and read. Nations are in an everlasting process of creating themselves through narratives, and there's a dialectical interchange between the nation that creates a master narrative for its culture text on the one hand, and the culture texts that provide a narrative for the nations on the other. Culture texts are twofolded. They tell us the story of the society in which they were written by means of representing that society, and simultaneously, they modify the perspectives and ways of thinking of the society that reads or watches them. If Benedict Anderson is right, arguing that printed materials in general, and novels, as well as newspapers in particular, have great importance in the shaping of modern societies, because they provide society with objects, notions, and representations that apparently help it imagine its common ground. If Anderson is right, it requires us to try and understand how Israeli cultural texts represent one of the most influential institutions in Israeli society, its army. I chose to focus on the representation of the army in the text dealing with the Israeli-Arab conflict in the late 1970s and the 1980s. It was in this decade that the close relationship between society and its cultural texts resulted in recognizable changes that occurred both in the socio-political and national sphere, as well as in Israeli cultural texts. The changes that took place regarding the real conflict can be seen in all its sectors. On the international realm, the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt proved that the Israeli-Arab conflict was no longer a threat to the existence of Israel. The notion that Israel could defend itself through peace agreements and that the option of giving land for peace may be implemented changed the way Israeli society perceived the conflict. The relationship between the Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel changed, and the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank also went through essential changes during the late 1970s and the 1980s. As expected, because of the knot between cultural text and the reality in which they are written, while dramatic changes regarding the real conflict were taking place, the representation of the conflict in cultural texts underwent modifications as well. It is impossible to determine what came first, the modification in cultural texts or the changes in reality. But it is reasonable to assume that the changes occurred at the same time and had a mutual influence. These changes can be seen in Israeli cinema, Israeli theater, Israeli prose fiction, Israeli textbook, and in other cultural modes of representation. Although the differences in changes that can be seen in each of these cultural modes of representation, they all have similar traits in common, like the fact that in comparison with the years before, in the 1980s, more texts deal with the issue of the conflict, and they bring to the forefront not only the Jewish Zionist narrative, but the Palestinian one as well. The army, being a key component in the representation of the conflict, is represented in a majority of the cultural texts. In most of them, it is not merely represented, but has a central role. Therefore, I find it interesting to show how it is represented, what role it plays in cultural texts dealing with the conflict, and how is its representation influenced by the fact that the rendering of the conflict as a whole diminished, at the period discussed, the authority of the traditional Jewish Zionist narrative. A distinction should be made between cultural texts dealing with the conflict between Arabs and Jews inside Israel, and cultural texts dealing with the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Although similar phenomena can be observed in texts dealing with the two types of conflict, the function of the IDF is different in each of them. In addition, whereas the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians was represented in a variety of texts, the conflict between Arabs and Jews inside of Israel was less often dealt with. I want to start by talking about the role of the army in the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. Although different kinds of civilian relationships have existed between Israelis and Palestinians, and although cultural texts can construct whatever relations they want, they almost always tell the stories of the conflict in which the interaction is between the Israeli army and the Palestinian civilians. The army is represented as the only institution in Israel that has a direct and permanent interaction with the Palestinians. Only the army knows their way of living, only the army can explain their way of thinking, and it is the army that seems to possess an exclusive understanding of the Palestinian society. Whether in South Lebanon or in Gaza and the West Bank, the kinds of interaction described, love stories, violent incidents, war, personal acquaintances, all involve soldiers. The army is therefore seen as the overall representative of Israel and its relations of any kind with the Palestinians. Even in the few texts that tell stories about types of interaction that are non-violent and non-militaristic, the army is still mostly represented as an important factor. In the movie Fictive Marriage by Chaim Buzagel, for example, the Israeli Jewish protagonist deceives his wife when he tells her that he is leaving for New York, but actually stays in Israel. In his suitcase, which he leaves in the airport, he puts his army uniform. He eventually ends up employed with Palestinians who enter Israel in order to work, while pretending to be deaf, so as to conceal from them the fact that he is not a Palestinian himself. The army uniform, shown only for a few seconds at the beginning of the movie, tells us that his supposed trip, which turned out to be an intensive encounter with the Palestinians that arouses his and Israel's society's entire set of national stereotypes, is actually part of what should be seen as a military service. And so, even in a movie that doesn't have anything to do with the army, but deals with a civilian interaction between Palestinians and Israelis, the army is present, shown to have a small but meaningful role. The central role of the army in almost all the representations of interactions between Israelis and Palestinians result in the Palestinian understanding of the Israeli army as the sole representative of Israeliness, dominating every aspect of Israel's daily lives. As a matter of fact, it sometimes seems as though the characteristics of the sovereign state that owns this army are unimportant, because the Palestinians only interact with the agent. In the novel Shahid by Avi Valentine, for example, the Palestinian terrorist says, "These were the Jews I knew. All of them were soldiers. I couldn't imagine Jews without army uniform and high shoes. I only saw soldiers in khaki with weapons." In the movie An Arab Bridge by Nissim Dayan, for another example, the Israeli army seems to be so well established inside the Palestinian society that it takes part in defending certain people in the society and knows everything that goes inside it, even more than the local Palestinians do. Is it therefore not surprising that the Israeli reserves officers tell Laila, the Arab widow whom he is in love with, With me you can do anything you want. I'm the law here. Here, meaning both inside Israel and in the territories. But the most significant example of the function of the army as intervening in every aspect of Palestinian society life, and at the same time being seen by the Palestinians as the embodiment of Israel, is to be found in the novel The Smile of the Lamb by David Grossman, that also became a film. Hilmi, an Arab, holds Uri, an Israeli officer, as a hostage, threatening to kill him if the Israeli army does not evacuate the entire occupied territories. Not surprisingly, it is not the state of Israel or its government to whom he addresses his claim, but the army, the only institution that is in any kind of interaction with the Palestinians, and the governing body that rules their world. Even more interesting than the fact that the Palestinians see the army as the only representative of Israel is the fact that the army itself is seen as the only institution that can change Israel's attitude towards them. The cultural texts tell us a story in which it is not the government that shapes the policy, neither can any civilian have any influence in this area. Only the army does. The army changes its attitude towards the Palestinians at will and practically decides how to act. The civil leadership is hardly ever mentioned, and when it is described, it is treated with disappointment and scorn. This, in turn, leads the army officers to decide by themselves how to treat the Palestinians. In Tatuan by Yitzhak Ben-Ner, for example, Chul, the Israeli General Security Service person, says that his job, I quote, is one of the few jobs in which an individual can significantly influence reality, and adds that if people like him disappear, the Israeli nation will be lost, as if the field officers are those determining the fate of Israel. The Smile of the Lamb constructs a similar pattern, as we are told that the main reason that the two Israeli officers have decided to do military service is their hope that through these jobs they will be able to change reality and to assist Palestinians. The implication is that there is no civil act that can achieve the same effect. Another example can be given from the allegoric novel The Road to En Harod by Amos Kainan. The brigadier general, who has been captured by a guy called Rafi, tells him that he had captured and killed the chief of staff, the ministers, and the prime minister because they had ruined everything, and that he, as a brigadier general, is looking for a new prime minister. These aspects of the all-inclusive, omnipotent role ascribed to the army in cultural text are also relevant to the question of the way it is shown to treat Palestinians. The IDF is presented as a cruel, harsh, violent armed military which abuses the Palestinians. The relations between the soldiers and the Palestinian population seems to be almost intimate. The soldiers walk in their streets, enter their houses, and watch every move they make. And at the same time, keep a distance from the Palestinians, which enables them to act harshly against them. And yet, despite the almost unlimited power granted to the army, the soldiers themselves seem to be frustrated about the violent act that they perform. They behave cruelly and feel bad about it, hit Palestinians and cannot handle their violence, and perpetuate the harsh attitude towards the Palestinians while speaking against it. The soldiers' acts are not meant to be abusive, and they apparently do not mean to be violent, but the situation in which they are involved leads them to these acts. This schizophrenic situation is also demonstrated by the soldiers' only partial understanding of why they act the way they do, what their job exactly is, and in what political situation they are involved. Again, although making and implementing the rules as they go, the soldiers sometimes seem not to know why they are participating in these confrontations, and almost always seem to have reservations about their own behavior. In the movie Ricochet by Eli Cohen, known in Hebrew as Two Fingers from Tzidon, for example, set in Lebanon, Gadi, a new officer, asks one of the soldiers to tell him about the situation in Lebanon. Although he has been there for a long time, the soldier tells him that he hadn't understood anything until an expert Orientalist had come to give the soldiers a lecture. Only then were they told what was going on in the place where they were practically spending all their time. Another example is provided by the movie Cup Final by Eran Riklis, in which a reserve Israeli soldier, captivated by a group of Palestinians in Lebanon, tells his captors, "We didn't want to go into this war." And the head of the captors answers him, "All Israeli soldiers say that, and yet you keep on making one war after another." All this adds up to a situation in which most of the characters of Israeli soldiers in cultural texts of the 1980s dealing with the conflict end up losing their minds. Being abusive, but believing that they shouldn't be. Not fully comprehending why they need to act the way they do, but performing every order. Not understanding why they have to be placed inside the Palestinian cities, but in fact invading into people's own houses and operating inside them. Being in apparently intimate relations with the Palestinians, but quite distinct from them. Feeling like the rulers of the world, but not being able to live and act as they believe they should. All these contradictions lead to a state in which the soldiers can no longer carry on with their ordinary lives, and they lose their minds. It therefore seems as if cultural texts dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict criticize the role of the army in Israeli society. But, as I will try to argue, they actually defend and strengthen the pro-army narrative while apparently speaking against it. I will come back to this point later, but now I want to shortly speak about the representation of the role of the army regarding the Jews and Arab relationships inside Israel. Like those texts that deal with the relationships between Israelis and Palestinians, the texts that describe the connections between Jews and Arabs inside Israel also tell a story in which the army has a crucial role, this time within the Israeli society. The story that these Israeli cultural texts tell us is one in which no normal relationship can persist between Jewish and Arab Israeli citizens. Love relations and any other kind of ties simply fail to prevail, and the conflict between the two societies emerges and ruins personal connections. Interestingly, although the reason for the failure of the interpersonal contacts seems to be the difference in nationality, in the inability of the two societies to allow one of their members to have any kind of close relations with a member of the outgroup, it is the Israeli army that functions as the instrument that separates between the two national groups. The army is brought to the forefront. Since Arabs cannot be part of it, the army serves to separate them from the Jews who do get recruited. In the novel A Good Arab by Yoram Kanyuk, for example, Yosef is a half Arab, half Jew, but he is brought up as a Jew. As an adolescent, he writes Zionist manifestos. He believes that the Jewish people have a right over the land of Israel, even if this means Arabs should be killed. He reads the protocols of the Eichmann trial and forces his family to celebrate the bar mitzvah for him. However, when the time comes, he doesn't get recruited to the IDF because his father is an Arab. He understands this means that he will no longer be part of his friend's society and struggles against the authorities in order to be recruited, but in vain. The consequence of his staying out of the army is, indeed, his removal from society. A similar pattern appears in A Trumpet in the Wadi by Sami Michael. The only way in which Alex, the Russian immigrant, can become part of the Israeli society is by serving in the army. Be part of the society is by serving in the army. In all other respects, he does not belong. He doesn't speak well. He doesn't speak Hebrew well. He lives in an Arab neighborhood. He has an Arab girlfriend. It is only through his military service that he officially becomes a member of the Israeli Jewish society. At the end of the novel, he is killed during his service in the Lebanon War, and this death renders him a full member of the Israeli society. Huda, his Arab girlfriend, is left alone, pregnant, with doubts whether to keep their child. If I would raise him in a Jewish neighborhood in 18 years, she says, I will have to give up my son to another war. He will want to go to an elite unit. All his life he will try to show how dedicated he is just because he has an Arab mother. Huda doesn't know that her son, being half Arab, would probably not be recruited at all. But she understands that if she chooses to raise him in a Jewish environment, the only way for him to become a member of the society will be to serve in the army. These two novels also tell stories in which the army's presence in Israeli society is so powerful that it even undermines the romantic relations between Jews and Arabs. Although these interpersonal relations seem to be very strong, and although the characters do not seem to be particularly attached to their nationality, the Jewish characters find themselves committed to the army to a degree that threatens their relations with their lovers. In the dilemma they confront, whether to become part of the IDF or to remain with their lovers, the Jews choose the IDF. Eventually, the romantic ties continue, but not before the protagonist's declaration that they prefer the Jewish-Israeli army. Not surprisingly, in the movie Ricochet, which was produced by the IDF's filming unit, the loyalty to the army that is stronger than the commitment to the lovers, friends, and family can be seen even when the conflict is not between Jews and Arabs. The love affair between Rauf, the Druze Israeli soldier, and his fiancée from South Lebanon ends when he avoids answering her family's questions whether he will fight against them if South Lebanese stop cooperating in Israel, and then he gets mysteriously murdered. Since Israeli Arabs are a minority that tries to be part of the Jewish majority, and since the only way for one to be part of the society is by serving in its defense force, even the Arab characters are portrayed as willing to collaborate with the Jewish army. Yosef of A Good Arab, for example, is led for that reason to cooperate with the General Security Service. Huda and her mother in the Wadi, although they pray for the Palestinian victory in Lebanon and even have a cousin killed there, find themselves supplying Alex with food and clothes before he goes to fight in a war against their relatives. They wish him to come back safe, even though this means that members of their own people would get killed. This same phenomenon can also be seen in novels written by Arabs, like Arabesque by Anton Shamas and The Optimist by Emil Habibi. The optimist is a collaborator who tries to survive in Israeli society by collaborating. And in Arabesque, there are characters of Arabs who collaborate with the army. Both novels tell stories of Arabs who want to be part of the society and that rejects them, and who realize that in order to be accepted, they must be part of the security institutions. Yet, since the conflict is between the Jews and the Arabs, the army being a tool in the hands of the Jewish people, they will never be equal partners in the security services, and therefore will never become part of the Israeli society. We can conclude that the representation of the IDF in cultural texts dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the 1980s show it to have unconstrained power. It rules the Palestinians, it takes on the job of civilian institutes, it acts in harsh and abusing ways, it is not open for criticism, although it is not happy with its own behavior, and this all adds up to the soldier's mental breakdown. When examining the representation of the IDF in cultural texts dealing with the Jewish-Arab conflict inside Israel, it seems that here too the army is granted too big of a role. It decides who can be part of a society and who cannot. It is seen as so important that Jewish characters are willing to lose their lovers in order to serve in it. The Arab characters are willing to collaborate with it, and it performs the unpleasant task of excluding Arabs from Israeli society. Put together, the army is represented as both the agent that decides and implements the Israeli attitudes and Israeli policy towards the Palestinians in the territories, and the chief factor that shapes Israeli society from within. But, although it seems as if cultural texts criticize the army, I think it is valid to say that Israeli culture texts that deal with the conflict provide a vision biased by the ultimate, or Tom, how do you say it? The ultimate attribution error? You told me that there's another name for it? The fundamental attribution error, or the ultimate attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is a cognitive perceptual bias that describes the following human tendency. When a good performance is given by a member of one's in-group, she will attribute it to her personal traits, whereas a good performance by a member of the out-group will be attributed to external circumstances, like a situation that made her act well or an easy task that she was asked to perform rather than her skills or characters. On the other hand, when negative performance is performed by a member of the in-group, it will be attributed to external circumstances rather than to her character, while a negative performance by a member of the out-group will be attributed to her character. Therefore, when I say that Israeli culture texts that deal with the conflict provide a vision biased by the ultimate attribution error, I mean that they do not describe the army positively, but always give a reason justifying this representation, the negative representation. The soldiers abuse Arabs, but don't mean to do so. It is the stressful situation or the provocation of the Arabs that leads to these acts. They decide how to act and what policy to implement, but feel as if they don't support this policy and believe that they were forced into it, and that's why they lose their minds. They don't want to be prejudiced or racist, but the fact that Arabs don't get recruited to the army forces them not to accept them into their society. They apparently prefer their personal love to the love of their country and the army, but cannot help being a part of what Dina from a Good Arab calls the Jewish genetic code materialized in the army. And so the representation of the Israeli army in cultural text, although criticizing the army, eventually excuses its action and justifies its role. External factors lead the army as a whole and its soldiers as individual characters to impossible positions and circumstances. The army is then forced to act in ways that seem inappropriate. Apparently, the army doesn't want to hold so much power. It doesn't want to act in the way it does. It doesn't want to determine the nature of Israeli society, but circumstances forces it to do all these things. Eventually, it even seems to the readers and viewers as if, although the negative representation of the army, it acts in the best way it can in a given situation into which it was put against its will. We can conclude that in the cultural text of the 1980s, the army is criticized severely and represented pejoratively, but there is always some justification for its actions, and in spite of all the condemnations that might be made against it, it is still portrayed as doing the best it possibly can in difficult circumstances. The cultural texts, even when trying to criticize the army, end up telling the story of its defense.
Right. Comments, questions? What happens after the 1980s?
I don't know. I can't say that I didn't study it, and so I don't want to give an answer.
Change, or does this thing, does this attitude
I believe that the culture texts in general are part of the Jewish Zionist narrative, which and that's why they keep on telling stories that are close to the pro-army narrative.
I want to just sort of press you a little bit as to whether what are we really seeing here situational attribution, right? Which is the claim that you're making, situational as opposed to dispositional attribution being the basic notion of the fundamental attribution error. Because the way, as I read what you describe, is in which rather it's not that they're compelled to by the situation, but as much by the habit or the role involved in being embedded within a military culture. In other words, it seems to me implicit in these texts a damning of a sort of an unthinking, habituating military culture, rather than simply compelled to by the structure of the situation, right? So, for example, here, this is also the case with, is this Holy of Tatuon? Is that how it's... who seems to be a perfectly educated young soldier with good intentions, who finds himself abusing an Arab without realizing the horrors deeds which are regularly performed as part of his unit's daily work. There's a sense of ritual and habituation, at least in the way you're depicting this. I haven't read the text, obviously. Which to me doesn't sound like situational attribution, but sounds a lot like the characterization of, in sociological role theory, of how people behave when embedded in particular roles, and those roles may have a variety of sources that are culturally embedded, but they have nothing to do with situation. The other thing that to me was very interesting is you described that most of the soldiers end up committing suicide in these stories. And that, in fact, suggests that, part of the reason we get the fundamental attribution error is to resolve problems of cognitive dissonance, right? So that we don't say, hey, we're really bad people doing bad things, but we're just forced to by the situation. Well, that's sort of a little bit odd. In other words, if they come to terms with the fact that they're really bad people, that is, if they're engaging in dispositional attribution, I understand why they engage in suicide. But it's a bit puzzling why they would engage in suicide, why they would commit suicide, if they've resolved that cognitive dissonance by engaging in situational attribution. In other words, the characters themselves don't seem to be resolving the cognitive dissonance, and that's why they end up committing suicide. That's just sort of the substantive question.
Let's give him a chance.
All right.
Otherwise we're going to lose.
I can go.
Yeah, I'm sure you can.
We can talk about it later. I think that answering your first question, I think it is the situation and not the environment. That's how it seems to me. And I think this answers your second question as well. Because they don't all commit suicide, but they do lose their minds. It is as if they're in a situation they cannot handle, but they cannot go against. I mean, they cannot say that's where they are. They don't have any choice but being there, and that's not clear what I said, right? What? Later on. Maybe later on. I don't know how to explain it. I'll think about it. Gabi has a.
In a way, I want to continue what Ron said about the disposition or the basic positions of these writers. It seems to me that you are quoting mostly leftist, quote unquote, leftist writers. Do you have rightist writers protecting the military or, and so on?
Well, no. My claim is that the leftist writers also protect the military. They try. I know. They try to talk to write a story.
I understand that, but I'm reading the text, I'm not reading your interpretation.
Okay.
The text, and I see that the leftists are critical of the military. This is my interpretation.
Oh, okay.
But leave the leftists. Tell us a little bit about rightists writing about the military.
I'm not sure there are rightists in Israel. Right writers in Israel. Bibi always gives Eyal Meged as one, but I'm not sure how many there are. And even when I say that in this decade, the 1980s, there are much more text, movies, or novels dealing with the Israeli-Arab conflict, it is still, there are not so many texts, which is quite surprising due to the fact that it's such an important issue in Israeli public discourse. But maybe, I don't know, 10, 20, so I cannot do this right.
All right, in which case we'll move on. And our third presentation for the morning brings yet another perspective The presenter is Chava Brownfield-Stein, who is also a doctoral candidate. She's at the graduate program of Gender Studies at Bar-Ilan University. And her areas of interest are gender, visual culture and hermeneutics, photography, military and sociology. And the subject of her presentation is going to combine at least some of these fields. And her talk is about visual representation of IDF women soldiers and civil militarism in Israel.
Security Service Law 1949 laid the foundations for a phenomenon that was very crucial and unusual for the time, the mandatory conscription of both men and women. The law of 1949 has since proved crucial in shaping the distinctive features of Israeli society, the Israeli army, and the civil militarism in Israel. Since then, photographs of women soldiers have been part of the Israeli cultural memory and fascinated the media here and around the world. Nevertheless, despite their popularity and the extensive exposure of these images, and in spite of the dominance of visual imagery in Western culture, to this day, no research has been done concerning visual representation of IDF women soldiers. This current research is the first to focus and address the role of the visual field and the implications of photos of IDF women soldiers on the militaristic character of Israeli society. The study proposes a visual analysis and explores the latent affinities between women's service, photos of women soldiers, and cultural fascination with militarism. Archival material from 1948 to 1968 provides the databases. The interdisciplinary research is based on visual culture, sociology, and gender studies. The main goals of this presentation are those the following: to examine the interdependency between state apparatus and photography, to explore photos of women soldiers taken by official photographers, to expose through photos of women soldiers the military locus as a formative space of power and enjoyment, control, and eroticism, to exhibit the affinities between photos of women soldiers and the elusive ways by which militarism is slowly diffusing into and spreading throughout the whole social body. One of the preferred goals of the state and its mechanism during those decades was production of national memory via the visual field. Official photos were the only ones I examined in order to focus on the mutual relationship between state apparatuses and photography. Most of them, of these representations, were disseminated to the public, and all of them were taken by photographers of the army and of the government press office. The photographers were all men. I claim that the gender had a crucial impact on the way the public perceived these images and on the way the public icon of IDF woman soldier was imprinted onto the collective memory. The current discussion will include three groups of photos taken in public sphere. On the border, a military parade in civic space. This group includes photos of women soldiers marching on military parades through civic space and city streets. A military parade at that point can be described as a temporary invasion into a public civic space and as a phenomenon in a field of vision which can be observed from both spheres. To closed military zone, no civilian allowed. This group includes photos of women soldiers in the military space, the army camp. The army camp is seen here as a space of inclusion and exclusion, and the military terratopia is regarded as a safeguard, keeping all illicit civilians outside and those defining the structure of citizenship and the borders of civil space. women dormitories, no men allowed. The group includes photos of women soldiers in their dormitories. In this current group, two mechanisms organize the spatial and power relations. The first includes and excludes civilians through the defense service law. The second is of bureaucratic mechanisms and the military code of normalization. These army procedures include and exclude inside the military zone through the criteria of gender and duties. My claim is that there is a structural affinity between two groups, that of the first and that of the third. I argue that during these decades, photographic images of women soldiers were shifting on the fringe and in between two poles of aesthetic representational systems. These two systems were merely one of the more obscure conditions to smooth the ways for cultural osmosis between military space and the civic one. I shall open my presentation with a photograph which was published in a famous book on a double page. Looking at this specific photo and reading the caption, we can say that the space is a military space. The frozen moment is a transitional moment between the women taking off their ordinary clothes and putting on army uniforms. This transformational process is manifested on the bodies of young women. Theirs is the body we gaze at, gendered bodies of sexual mature women upon which the political technologies of the body are exercised. Looking at this photo as a product of observational mechanisms, the women who are represented seem unaware of the observers and the observational act. A critical reading might find two assumptions that are neither contradictory nor mutually exclusive. The first is that the panoptical mechanisms might have been so obvious that the women ceased to notice it. The second might indicate that even though everyone and everything are visible, the apparatuses seemed to be invisible. Furthermore, it appears that interplays between visibility and invisibility guarantee order. Just as the interplays between cultural modes of permission and prevention characterize eroticism. I quote, "All women dormitories are off limits. No men are allowed in women dormitories, not even in a case of needed repairs, unless granted permit." This order implies that the profession and the camera both act as a safeguard. They provide a male soldier the privilege to enter a no-entrance zone and grant the lens the freedom to offer civilians legitimate voyeurism and an opportunity to peek inside a closed military space and gaze at women soldiers who are performing actions that are seen as intimate daily routine. The photographic view observing the women from behind raises another issue. It exposes the observational look as a voyeuristic and a scopophilic one. Scopophilia means pleasure in looking, and is essentially active and erotic. This exposes the schema, the panoptical schema, as a conjunction of looking as supervision and looking as pleasure, which one of its manifestations is that of turning the bodies into docile bodies, the other is representing the bodies as erotic bodies. The eye of the photographers and the lens of the camera take the role of seducer, creating a new form of collective voyeurism for the civilian outside the military camps. Looking at these two photos, we can wonder, Why was such a special permit given to the public eye via the eye of the photographic medium? Why was it allowed to pick at those women soldiers? What public right or cultural practice enabled the camera to enter no entry domain and gather then and there a visual evidence? Was it possible to raise these questions without the camera being used as a supervision apparatus and without the interdependency between visual mechanisms and disciplinary mechanisms? What sorts of exchange goes on through the field of vision? Power, approval, pleasure? These two photos are classified as photojournalism or documentary genre. Through them, parts of the invisible aspects of reality became visible, and fragments of the unknown become familiar. Under the mask of documentary genre, civilians' eyes can invade closed zone out there and enjoy visual pleasure looking at images of other bodies while desiring to see what is not shown. The simultaneity of it was there and I was there contribute to the aura of authority and authenticity associated with photographic images. So daily routine event can be therefore grasped as natural, the space as transparent, and the act of the photography as reflecting reality and representing the military domain. Nonetheless, what we see is a result of cultural construction, a process of framing and selection, which is guided by cultural codes and expectations. What we are looking at is actually a production of traditional visual codes which presume a heterosexual male viewer observing indoor domestic spaces and thus providing an erotic quality. Yet, to name this visual pleasure a male gaze and to analyze it only as an exercise of power and gender relation is important, but nevertheless only partial. In a different context, images like this might be considered as an individual illegitimate voyeurism. Here, they provide legitimate models for collective voyeurism and attached to the military domain. Moreover, throughout these images, the military space is represented and loaded with erotic imagination and sexual possibilities which are associated with indoor domestic places. While visual pleasures are provoked from watching images of women soldiers' bodies, they are, at the same time and indirectly, perceived as enjoying militarism. The singularity of the specific event is lost as it becomes accessible through photos to many viewers in diverse places. Besides, the publicity of these photos suggested that disciplinary mechanism might be invisible, but the power must be exposed and seen. This relies on the logic of mutuality and dialectic interactions between the power's demand to be acknowledged and stemming from that, the power delegated to various participants of the photographic event. This description draws the complex relations between photographic and state apparatuses and describes the significant impact of photography on the mutual spillover between military systems and civil society. Although it is important to indicate the way this photo represents women soldiers' body, it is more than necessary to emphasize how this erotic enjoyment attached to military images spills over into everyday life outside military camps. Such photos were extremely common and totally acceptable, and therefore it is crucial to note them. Both this and the following photo are part of a series of 30 taken by army photographer Polsky and published at B'Machane. It's a newspaper, an army newspaper. The mission might have been the coverage of an army swim contest, but the camera captured what Walter Benjamin defined as optical unconsciousness. What these photos and the next offer to the public are more than just visual representation of military space as a space of enjoyment and fantasy in the midst of ideological structure. This representation delineates the cultural position of the public figure and IDF woman soldier as one of, I quote, the different sort of little things around which individuals and community center their fantasies and their life. It's from Morty. The supposedly innocent photos that are officially produced for a certain purpose but actually served another enable us to examine them in what Zizek called looking array. Looking array enable us to distinguish the gaps between the symbolic history of the collective and the hidden phantasmatic history confirming that of on the surface. Looking array reveals these photos unaware pleasure layers melted into an egalitarian unifying aura of army service. These photos are like peepholes through which we can see behind the bright aura of terms like equality or liberalism the shady side of the law and its latent effects. They are like dark eyeglasses that enable us to look through the bright images of organized military parades that sometimes can blind our sight. The amazing spectacles of the military parade does not automatically invoke terms like eroticism, voyeurism, or passion, terms that easily come to mind when watching photos of women soldiers in their dormitories. Nevertheless, inspired by Lacan's word that desire is the other side of the law, I can assert that photos of women soldiers, quote, are the other sides of photos of women soldiers marching through cities' streets. During the first decade, an outstanding number of parades were held in Israeli cities. The audience was fascinated and trapped by the glamour effect of the women soldiers marching alongside men soldiers. Stimulated by Zizek's claims about object cause of desire, psychic structure, and structural necessity of fascination, I would assert that performative mechanism and the unifying process of military spectacles, as well as the mediation of photography, are diminishing the importance of the one and wrapping the many and their visual representation with a bond of desire. The charisma and charms greatly exceed each individual's qualities and are not necessarily their own specific virtues, although they can be experienced as such. All the same, this bond of desire is charging the disciplinary mechanism of the military with a superplus of desire and extra charms. And I will conclude. The public icon of IDF women soldier of the first decade was modifying between two aesthetic representational systems. It combined the purified, almost clinical representational principles which refer to masculine and militaristic cultural codes with a more exposed, bare erotic, and feminized imagery. The visual vocabulary of photos of women soldiers that were distributed in civic sphere operated as a shortcut to erotic fantasy and in turn left civilian life with what Brown named a certain afterglow, and I would add a certain militaristic afterglow. Their photos were like little instruments of enjoyment, moving from space to space, delivering visions and evoking desire. This paper discussed the role of the visual field and claims that visual presentation of women soldiers were one of the more obscure conditions for the cultural osmosis between systems which characterizes civil militarism in Israel. Their presence in the army camps and the way they represented have an important contribution for the erotization of militarism in Israel and for the social cultural fascination with IDF. Thank you.
Comments, questions?
The second time I've heard you, absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
I have a question, and it may be that your analysis is very theory-driven. It's theory-driven with the assumption, going back to psychoanalysis, feminist studies, through Zizek and all these people that we like to cite today to show that we're in.
You forgot Foucault.
Okay, Saint Michel.
Okay.
And your analysis was very convincing in terms of the nexus between eroticism, desire, the woman's body, and so on. But I want to offer you a complementary. That is, I'm not arguing with you, but I think there's another aspect here, and it's related to the enjoyment.
Yeah.
And my hypothesis would be that some of the pictures, the unstated aim, it's an unconscious aim, is to soften the image of the military, to soften its direct relationship to violence.
Yes, I agree.
It's not only eroticism.
Yes, of course.
It's this kind of aspect which was very...
Yes,
would you
yes.
accept that kind of interpretation?
I agree with you as well.
It's a related comment, and I just thought this was fascinating, and makes me think I want to
learn to
adapt this kind of analysis. So this may be a naive reading, and it's not quite the same point as softening. One of the themes, and I'll say more about this afternoon, in terms of the panel discussion there, I think, but one of the themes that's gone through everything that we've heard, including your presentation, is this relationship between civil and military. And it seems to me, from a sort of British standpoint, where conscription is the exception, not the rule, historically, the default response of Britain is always to have an all-volunteer force. My comment is a British perception of the Israeli military and Israeli civil military relations is that we come to it from a long debate with other European countries about civil military relations. And if you look at conscription or national service, there are two ways in which it can work. One is conscription can militarize society. You take young people and you militarize them. And you can also use it to coercively organize the politics. But conscription is neutral in the sense that you can also use it to do the other way. Conscription can be used to civilianize the military.
Yes.
And it can also be used to mitigate any coercive effects of a top-down organization of conscription. This was the great debate in Germany halfway through the 19th century. So when I look at these images, from a British, this is by my naivety, if you like, my reading is this is not simply softening the face of the military and violence and so on, it's reminding the viewer that these are civilians who happen to be wearing uniforms. So instead of militarized women, this is a feminine example of a civilianizing effect on the military. And that's how I, as a British person, would look at this. So it's not simply militarization of women.
No, no,
It's the other way around. I see this as equally a civilianizing effect.
May I add one sentence?
Yes.
Is anything that has to do with the military falls under the title militarism?
If the women are in the army, it is military.
Is it militarism?
Well, I think it's not quite the
It's
same
the
question.
same- it's the
Go
same-
first
the
to
same
that
question.
question, then go to that question.
About your questions, I didn't talk about militarizing women, not at all. I try to understand. I mean the perspective of smoothen the army and gentle the violence of the army. We really know it here in Israel. We know that was the duty of the women soldiers. We know that, but for me, what was interesting was to understand something that is more deeper than what we know about, being the officer wife or being the mother of the soldiers. We know that, but I wanted to make clear for me and for everyone something that inside this, which is more in a level of erotic, and it's yes, that. היא שאלה מה אירוטי. I think when you come to definition of erotic, it's the difference with erotic has to do with forbidden for a certain time with strict orders what to do. All this is it's by definition with erotics when it comes to literature. So in the army you have all this. You can find this criteria.
Well, I was just going to follow up on your Perry's comment about militarism, because there's nothing, I didn't see anything militaristic. If anything, as you pointed out, there's a softening of the military, and I'm just wondering where the militaristic...
But what is suffering the militaria? When you think about what is suffering militaria, the concept suffering, yes, to suffering, yes, I say suffering, but I but I mean suffering. Maybe that's what I felt. But yes. But when you think about what is to suffer a military, that's one way of militarism. That's
well, I think that in the classic militarism literature, when you go back to Alfred Fox and the totalitarian literature, you see more of the military parade type of.
Yes, but that's so. Simplicity.
No, but that's what militaristic.
yes, but it's so obvious. We don't think it's obvious that a military parade is militarism. Okay, that's obvious.
Well, but that's just one. There's you have a very, usually in a militaristic society, you have a very coercive type of society where the military, where people don't look like they're smiling in the military, where there's a lot of pressure on the soldiers, where it's dark, it's totalitarian, it's everything that this picture is not. And so
what a picture like this, which is so overwhelming, and the temptation, what it's done to send you a message about military. What do you get from that? You get that military is a nice thing. You can. It's better to be in the army. That's militarizing.
I'm sorry.
It's militarized, but
yes.
I don't think it's militarized.
It's seductive. Okay, yes, it is seductive.
Sorry, you've obviously raised a number of...
my thought goes to Colin Gray's book on soldiers, in which he contends that the uniform is sexy. The uniform of all sexes.
Bengal states that every woman in Israel prefer her male with uniform.
Okay, so let's turn that around then to the marching parade, and that's sort of an elevation of maybe all women to a sort of sexy level. Not necessarily erotic. The erotic pictures of the barracks, etc., being something different, but the public pictures of the parade and the parades themselves being expressions of bringing all women up to a higher erotic level.
Yes, and we know what's going on in the bases. We know.
Who's we?
We, the newspaper on the last month.
No, who's the intended audience?
The citizens.
Male, female.
Male, female, old, and yes.
Sorry.
Yes. A few comments. I believe that the benefits to Israel or to the army of women in the service is, first of all, it's a very, very great morale booster. I don't see it as something about militarism. I believe that a citizen, the concept of a citizen army is something which is very, very important. And I believe that one of the things that women do is that it creates a certain type of competition. If women can do it, then men can do it. That's why in many units, the madrachim or the instructors are women. They're tank instructors and they're other instructors. So if a woman instructs a man, or if it's in a race or anything, then of course a man has to be certainly as good as
Right, I'm going to interrupt you. Are you going to ask about the presentation, or are you going to ask about general about gender? If it's about the presentation, then I'm sure that Chava will be delighted. Okay. It's not really fair to ask her something that she didn't present.
Well, the I mean, there are other aspects of the presentation. I think that it's pride, it's public relations, and it also is how it reflects on the diaspora Jews. It's a good reflection for diaspora Jews as well.
You must decide whether you want to do this or
I don't know about diaspora Jews. I'm here in Israel.
You will. Yeah.
I think it was very, very, very interesting. I just want to say that regarding all the questions you were asked, when presenting it next time, in other conferences, maybe you can show pictures of men. I think that all the claims that you heard here, you can show how men were photographed, and that you can show the difference. What?
Some of them are eroticized also, and one of the I told a minute ago, Reuven Gal was the psychologist of the army, and he said that the army, all women likes their men with uniforms. So I know, but I have my deep claim is that the army is a kind of I will not open it now. A regulation, a sex regulation, okay. A regulation of sex, and that's one of the reasons why women were conscripted. But I will not open it now. Thank you.